Hi folks, Wooden Boat Dan here. Just wanted to give you a heads up. The podcast you're about to listen to was recorded several years ago, so some of the phone numbers, email addresses, website links, and time-sensitive information are no longer valid. Please keep that in mind as you listen. If you'd like to contact me, my email address is woodenboatdan@gmail.com. Thank you and enjoy the podcast. Welcome to Hooked on Wooden Boats weekly podcast episode number 114. I am your host, Dan Matson, aka Wooden Boat Dan. If you can't do it, don't even think about attempting it. And this is the world's first podcast fully dedicated to celebrating the art, craft, history, tradition, and romance of wooden vessels around the world. Thanks for tuning in today. For those of you that were looking for a podcast episode last week, I actually took the week off. It was Thanksgiving here in the U.S. on Thursday, which is when I publish my podcast on a weekly basis. And so I took the liberty to take the week off, and I appreciate you tuning in again this week. I just didn't think it would be a big deal if I missed 1 week. And to be honest, it was kind of nice to not have to put the podcast together and just think about some other things like being thankful for everything we have here in our home and in the U.S. and that sort of thing. So thanks for tuning in today. I've decided to continue my series called Interview the Expert. As you may know, I've done 6 podcasts with experts on different boat construction methods, starting with one episode in the 90s and then going through 100 and something. And you can find those on the index page of my website, by the way. You can look those up. And today is an Interview the Expert series on the use of epoxy. And the expert that I'm interviewing is Russell Brown of PT Watercraft in Port Townsend, Washington. Russell is an expert with epoxy. He's been using it for nearly 40 years. And so I've got a really good interview here with him. And also he has a book available on using epoxy efficiently and effectively. And you can find that on my homepage if you want to order that. It's $5.99 for an ebook. So stick around for the interview here in just a few minutes. Well, as I mentioned, I took last week off for Thanksgiving. I have been working on my second bench. As I mentioned, I built a bench for a consignment shop, and this second bench is coming out a little bit better than the first one. I'm using some cedar that I got out of some slabs of cedar out of a barn, and then used some old fencing that's kind of stained gray, and it came out looking pretty good. I actually put some varnish on it, but this time instead of varnishing like I would on a boat, I actually put it on with a cloth and rubbed it in, which made it a lot simpler than, brushing and sanding and that sort of thing. Anyway, finished my second bench. I'm looking forward to taking that to this consignment shop, see if it sells, and then maybe I'll build some more. Also wanted to let you know that the comments on my website, where you can leave a comment, they have not been working for several months. I finally paid somebody to fix that. So now I would really appreciate it if you would leave a comment on my website. If you scroll down to the bottom of each podcast episode at the end of the show notes, there's a little button there you can click on that says comments, and you can just leave your first and last name and a comment. That would be really cool to hear from you that way. So finally got that working. And the big news, which you may have already heard, is that I did sell my Scamp Forcel 1. I sold her about 10 days ago now to a family that's going to use her on Orcas Island in the San Juans. They're really excited to get her, going to have her finished. And the fun thing is I get to go visit when they've got her all done and possibly even go take a spin on her. So that would be pretty cool. So it's pretty exciting to sell the Scamp. I did get full price for her. She was the only wooden Scamp for sale in the world, so that was kind of cool. And but it's kind of sad to see her go, but I know I'll build some more boats. So, in fact, I'm pondering my next build. If you have ideas, shoot me an email. I've gotten several ideas from people so far, and they've been great ideas. The This will probably be a boat I will build to sell, most likely, unless somebody hires me to build a boat for them, which I'm willing to do that. So if you're listening, you'd like for me to build you a small boat, let's talk. Shoot me an email, dan@hookedonwoodenboats.com. By the way, if you want to see a video of my scamp being trailered away by her new owner, I put together just a 2-minute video. It's on my in the show notes for this episode, number 114. So if you go to this episode and you scroll down, you'll see a video there you can click on and watch it. It's kind of fun to take a video of something like that. Kind of a fun moment in my life of selling my first boat that I built to sell and made a profit. And man, it doesn't get any better than that, folks. I mean, that's one way to get in the wooden boat game. Because we all know this podcast is about getting in the wooden boat game. We've got some new subscribers to the e-newsletter. Robert Lund, Mark Cork, and Roger Kugler. Thanks for signing up, guys. For those of you that aren't aware, I have a month letter that I send out. Did I say I have a month letter? I have a newsletter. It's electronic that I send out on a monthly basis most of the time. Although in the month of October, actually November's newsletter came out December 1st, so there'll be two newsletters in December most likely. But anyway, if you want to sign up for that, it's free. Go to hookedonwoodenboats.com/subscribe and give me your first and last name and email address, and you'll be on the list, and you can unsubscribe at any time. It's a fun way for me to connect with people and find out what you're up to and share resources and tips and tricks and things like that. And also, for those of you that aren't aware, I have an affiliate program available for my ebook, which is called Get in the Wooden Boat Game, a guide for building your first boat. If you'd be interested in promoting the book on your website, if you have a boat-related website where it would fit nicely, shoot me an email and I'll give you information about that, and you can make a small commission for each sale that you make. Okay, we're going to move on to the interview with Russell Brown now of PT Watercraft. We're going to be talking about epoxy. Asked Russell a lot of questions. We had a great time, and we're going to go ahead and roll the tape. So take it away, Russell. Okay, it's November 20th, 2013. I am sitting with Russell Brown in Port Townsend, Washington. Russell, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
Yeah, we're sitting in Russell's shop with the wood heat fired up and sitting around some gorgeous boats and projects here. So, Russell, today's topic, as you know, is about marine epoxy, part of the Interview the Expert series. And a couple of weeks ago, I sent Russell a whole list of questions about epoxy and said, would you be willing to discuss this in an interview? And he said, yeah, and he did a bunch of research and stuff and came up with some good stuff. So let's dig into it here. So what exactly is marine epoxy and how long has it been around, Russell?
Well, mid-50s, I guess, is when epoxy started to be developed. And it started being used for marine applications by the Goujon brothers, who started in 1958 using epoxy, and then shortly after formulating their own epoxies, there was some issues with epoxy that they addressed very quickly and were able to basically formulate systems that would work for building boats with wood.
So were the original epoxies used in non-marine applications then, you think? Or
I don't really know what they were developed for. I can tell you that the largest use of epoxy today is sealing tin cans. So if you're wondered about the inertness of epoxies, once they're fully cured, that's your answer. That white coating inside cans is epoxy.
Really? Wow. So So why do they use it? What does that do?
To seal the metal, prevent botulism, I guess.
Really interesting.
Yeah.
Huh. Okay. So are today's epoxies, marine epoxies, have they changed over the years?
Yes, they continue to develop. They have developed ever since the beginning, and they've gotten better and better for now there's an epoxy for every application. There's epoxies for working with wood, wood epoxy boats. There's epoxies for laminating, making parts with fibers and epoxy. And they continue to get better and better. They're, like everything else, epoxy is a compromise between many different things. It's physical properties, strength, health and safety, heat resistance, workability. There's epoxies for coating, and they continue to get better and better all the time. One of the most exciting things that's happened in a long time in epoxy, I think, is a new product from West System called G-Flex, which it's an epoxy that's very tough and a little bit flexible, and it allows gluing things that previously were very hard to glue. And it's a toughened epoxy, and there have been a lot of toughened epoxies used in the aerospace industry for a long time. But the G-Flex is kind of the first one that's user-friendly enough to be applicable for a lot of the things that we do. You can glue dissimilar woods. It's the first epoxy that looks really promising for gluing certain parts in traditional boats because it does allow for some movement. You can glue plastics with it that were not wasn't possible before.
Yeah.
It's a 1-to-1 mix, so it's easy.
Oh, wow.
You can mix it like 5-minute epoxy. You just look at the size of the blobs on your mixing palette and get them the same size and stir them up, and away you go.
Wow. Interesting. So is all epoxy two-part, a resin and a hardener?
Yeah.
Okay.
They're basically two liquids that, when thoroughly mixed together, form a solid. Mm-hmm. That's what epoxy is.
And it's basically a plastic, or a type of plastic. Is that right?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah, it's all, and that's quite interesting. It's all petroleum based, although there are some vegetable components. For instance, G-Flex. One of the components in the hardener is made from the skins of cashew nuts.
Really?
So, yeah.
Interesting.
And there's been a lot of work to try to develop non-toxic epoxies made from vegetable matter, soybeans, whatever. And it is possible, but so far the physical properties are way down there. It's not something that's really viable yet. But West System is continuing to work on that.
Okay. So when should I be using epoxy for my boat building project, and when should I use other glues, in your opinion?
Well, I think the only time you'd use other glues, there are cases like some people building strip kayaks will edge glue the cedar with Tight Bond 3 or some kind of a good quality yellow glue. It leaves less of a glue line, less of a visible glue line. So I think in cabinet work or, really tight joints that you're going to bright finish, you might use other glues. Mm-hmm. If you were gluing something that was so uncritical, like in a strip plank kayak where you're going to fiberglass both sides of, the inside and the outside of the hull, the glue joint between the strips is not that critical, so you can get away with something like Titebond. But I wouldn't use it in anything bigger than a kayak because it really doesn't have the moisture resistance of epoxy.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So for what about with dimensional lumber as opposed to plywood, where the lumber's shrinking and swelling with temperature and moisture changes? You just mentioned the G-Flex product, but can you use epoxy with that?
Well, you're basically talking about traditional boat building, because if you're building a wood epoxy boat, there's no point in going halfway. There's no point in gluing a boat with epoxy and then not sealing the entire thing inside and out so that the moisture level can never change. And so I guess the answer to that is no, you wouldn't use epoxy to glue dimensional lumber that was going to be left unsealed.
I see.
It's not really a good idea, But that being said, scarfs in planking on traditional boat building could be done with G-Flex, and probably, if one really understood the science behind using a product like G-Flex, you could probably do it and never have a failure. So. A lot of these kind of questions can be directed to the tech support line at West System. If you have specific questions about using epoxy products in traditional boat building, then it's better to ask somebody that's more of an expert than I am.
Okay. So as you and I both know, there's some pretty big differences in prices of epoxy, marine epoxy. I mean, if you go online, you've got the premier brands that are, over $100 a gallon easily with the hardener, maybe $150. And then you've got some less expensive brands that are maybe half or two-thirds of that price. If I'm going to go build a boat, how do I figure out what I should use? What kind of epoxy?
Well, I don't think the price difference is really that much. It's not half or two-thirds. And that's a big question. My feeling is that we're talking about boats here. We're building boats that at one time, at least in that boat's history, it's somebody's life is going to depend on it. You know how things can go bad on a boat, and something happens that leads to another thing, and next thing you know, the structure of your boat is being severely tested. Or maybe even just in a routine sail, you're out in rough weather, you fall off a wave. With epoxy, you get what you pay for, and it can be very, very difficult for a boat builder or an epoxy user to get accurate information on physical properties of epoxy. It's very difficult. In fact, the only people that test every available marine epoxy are the Goujon brothers, and they test. They have a huge testing facility. They have 3 full-time scientists, chemists, and 2 full-time lab techs, and they test things all day long. They test physical properties of all kinds of materials. And so really the only way to get accurate information on physical properties is through the Goujon brothers, unless you're willing to do your own testing, which is very difficult. There's also not any body that, will. Epoxy companies aren't generally. Their products are not tested by a governing body. So an epoxy company could basically print whatever they want in terms of physical properties. And there's one prominent company that does just that. They publish test results, or they publish physical properties that are just over those of some West System products, when in reality they're between a half and 2/3 of what the West products are. I guess really to look at this, a very delicate issue between different epoxy companies and advertising. West System is basically the gorilla in the playpen. They have the biggest market share, and they will not come out and say that their epoxies are better than anybody else's. They won't say that they're stronger than anybody else's. They won't publish anything that says, hey, this cheaper epoxy is actually much weaker than what they're publishing. It just makes them look bad. And I think that I guess this should lead into it, my feelings about the Goujon brothers and West System. And in the whole time, I've been working with their material for almost 40 years. And in that time, I've always been impressed by their honesty in marketing. I've been really turned off by the way a lot of other companies have marketed. The Goujon started working with epoxy in 1958, and they've been formulating their own epoxies, up till now, since 1958. And I think their approach to marketing epoxies is quite unique. They started by basically mixing epoxies for their own boats, and their boats were experimental boats, and very, very lightly built experimental boats that they were taking offshore, out of sight of land. And they realized right off that their lives depended on this stuff, and it depended on they're working hard. They're doing their very best to make sure that their products were as good as they could be. So I think West is a company that recognizes that lives are at stake when people use their products. I believe even more strongly now than ever that West is a company that's more concerned with their products than they are with their profits. And I don't think you could say that about any other epoxy company. Basically what we're talking about here is what you get for your money when you buy epoxy.
Yeah.
Like I said, epoxy is it's a compromise between many things. Usability, physical properties are always up at the top of the list. Basically the strength of the epoxy. But there's workability, there's health and safety issues, there's a lot of issues at stake, and I believe very strongly that their products offer the best balance between all of the issues, all of the compromises involved.
Okay. So what's the most common mistake builders make with epoxy?
Well, there are so many mistakes that builders make with epoxy. I guess, the first thing you do with epoxy is you mix it up. You meter it, whatever the mixing ratio is, you're metering the stuff at that correct ratio. And if you're off in that ratio, you don't have to be off very much to basically destroy the strength of the epoxy. It can still get hard, but it won't be nearly as strong as it was. Basically, if you think of polyester resin, if you put in a little bit of catalyst and swish it around, it'll go off. If you put in a lot of catalyst and swish it around, it'll go off. Well, epoxy is not that way at all. Epoxy will only use, if you have an epoxy that's a 3-to-1 ratio and you mix it at 2-to-1, that means that there's a large part of resin that never gets catalyzed. So it's basically, if you're off one way or the other, there is a large part of unmixed resin or hardener in that solid that is never reacts with the other. So you're really limiting its strength by not metering it accurately. And then mixing it carefully is a big issue. You basically have to have a mixing cup with straight sides and a flat bottom, and a stir stick with straight sides and a flat end, and you have to mix it very carefully in that cup, very thoroughly. You have to scrape the walls of the cup. And so I would say that probably the most common mistake people make is to not meter it accurately and mix it thoroughly. Mm-hmm. And then from there on, it's a science. I could go on forever about what the best approaches are.
Okay.
I did just write a book called Epoxy Basics, which is available from our website PT Watercraft for $5.95 as a download. It's mostly photographic, large color photos, lots of info. So that's probably the best thing if you want to either learn how to use epoxy from the basics of using epoxy, or brush up on it, is just to download that book and read it. It covers all the processes, from mixing epoxy to gluing, filleting, glassing, fill coating, peel ply, amine blush, exotherm. It goes through the whole list of epoxy processes.
Okay, very good. Let's see, what are the coldest and hottest temperatures which you can use epoxy at, roughly?
Well, there's different hardeners for different temperatures. So, if you're working in a very, very hot climate, you can use the tropical hardener or, an ultra slow hardener. Cold environments present a little bit more of a challenge. I think in wood epoxy boat building, humidity is maybe more of an issue. And, I work in a shop that's fairly tight, and it's heated with wood heat, and it's kept fairly dry. My biggest issue is that I'm often gluing things up or coating something and then leaving for the night, and the fire goes out in the wood stove and it gets really cold overnight. If your epoxy can reach basically a rubbery stage before the temperature drops, it's better. Mostly that's a problem with glassing and coating. What happens is that moisture in the air will inhibit the hardener part of the epoxy, the hardener part of the mix. So really cold temperatures can negatively affect an epoxy mix. So it's best to make sure something is at least at the rubbery stage before the temperature drops. And you'd never want to use epoxy in 30 or 40 degree weather anyway. It's it's very difficult to work with when it gets cold.
So maybe 50 degrees and above is that kind of the bottom end, you think?
Yeah, I would say so. And then, if you're doing things like glassing or coating, room temperature makes it so much easier. Mm-hmm. And if you can't have that, you can use a heat gun. I talk about that a bit in my Epoxy Basics book. You're basically just warming the area that you're working on right then. You're following the roller and the brush with or whatever you're using with the heat gun held well back from the surface. You don't want to get it too warm because it can start to smoke. But a strange thing about epoxy is that a slight increase in temperature affects the viscosity a lot. If you just barely warm it up, it goes from honey to something much thinner than honey. And if you get it really warm, it's like water. So
yeah,
you can use that to your advantage.
Okay. What about the fumes from epoxy? I mean, like I use West Systems most of the time, and I can smell it. Should I be wearing a respirator? I mean, maybe that's a dumb question.
No, if you're doing a big glassing or coating job, or you have a lot of area of wet epoxy exposed, I wear a respirator for that sort of thing. Epoxy has very, very low VOCs. The basically chemicals flashing off into the environment. It's a fraction of, say, something like polyester or vinyl ester. It's a very small fraction of that. So it's not the biggest health hazard with epoxy. That being said, you want to have a respirator with charcoal cartridges, and it's important also to really know how your respirator works, really understand how the valves work. I use a cheap 3M half-face respirator, and it's really light, works really well, comfortable. I can wear it all day long. But the exhaust valve at the very front of the respirator can pop out of its little housing and without you really knowing it, and you can be inhaling through that valve when it should be inhaling through the filters. So it's important to really know your respirator, and also wash it, keep it clean. If you're using charcoal cartridges, they should come right off your respirator when you're done and go into a Ziploc bag, because they'll absorb things in your shop.
So comfortable in a respirator, that seems like an oxymoron to me.
Well, the little 3M one I find really comfortable, and I whenever I make the smallest amount of dust, that thing goes on. Whenever I'm making, working with fumes in the shop, it goes on.
Yeah,
it's more comfortable than a paper dust mask.
And you can use that with charcoal cartridges also?
Yeah.
Oh, really?
Those are dust filters that are on there right now, and you put charcoal cartridges on.
I'm gonna check that out when we're done here, Russell, because I don't like mine.
Yeah.
So, as we both know, epoxy gets very hard when it's fully cured. It's very difficult to sand. I mean, it's so hard. How do you minimize that? Because there's nothing more tedious than a lot of sanding that seems unnecessary. It's like drywalling your house and taping it yourself, and then you realize you're not really a taper, and so you're sanding.
Yeah.
And the pros come in and they just put it up and do one quick pass and they're done.
Well, I guess that's it. It's get good at working with it. Get good at doing clean work. We do as much pre-finishing of parts while they're laid flat on the table as we possibly can. So, in our kit boats, the whole inside of the boat is fiberglass before the boat's ever assembled. So it's done while the parts are laid flat on the bench. Sanding, it depends on what kind of finish you're after. If you're okay with some bumps in your final boat, a random orbit with a vacuum attachment is a great way to sand epoxy. what we end up doing a lot of on fiberglass surfaces is to hit the surface first with a sanding block. So it can be either a stiff sanding block for flat surfaces or a flexible sanding block for curved surfaces. And you're basically sanding out the lumps before you go at it with the random orbit. And that will leave a very flat surface for final coating or painting. That does lead into your previous question, though, about sanding. And sanding uncured epoxy, or epoxy that's not fully cured, is one of the two main health hazards with epoxy. So, I often try to sand before epoxy's fully cured because it's easier to sand. Obviously not if it's gumming up the sandpaper or beading up, it's not ready yet. But, if you come in 2 days later to sand something, it's going to be a lot easier than if you come in a week later. But that dust of epoxy dust that's not, that's from not fully cured epoxy is a health hazard, especially breathing it, but even skin contact. So wearing gloves and your dust mask and maybe even a paper suit is a good idea. I know that we're not talking about health hazards, but the main health hazard is skin contact. And I go into that a lot in the book, but you've got to find gloves that you like and that are tough and that you don't mind wearing. That's the first thing to do. If gloves are hard to put on or if they tear easily, you've got to find another. I have a brand that I really like, and I get multiple uses out of them, and I don't get close to anything without anything sticky without my gloves on. You also have to be very careful when you're doing things like decanting epoxy or if you have mini pumps and the mini pumps are dripping, you want to have them in a cardboard box with a rag underneath them, and don't ever get close to those jugs if they have epoxy on them without your gloves on.
Because that epoxy can go through your skin into your system. Is that what happens?
Yeah, and the hardener, all epoxy hardeners are corrosive. They will eat into your skin, and at least that's what corrosive means. I've never seen my skin eaten into, but I also don't get it on me. It's good to have, if you're going to be pouring epoxy from one container to another, have your gloves on, have a couple of paper towels ready to wipe up any drips, and then clean the cans so that there's nothing left on the cans. There's no unmixed epoxy anywhere. If you spill even a drop of it on the floor, wipe it up, get it off of the floor, because you'll drag your power cord through it, and the next thing you know, every time you coil your power cord, you're going to be getting epoxy on your hands. And if you get epoxy on your skin, the best way to get it off is with waterless skin cleaner, the kind that mechanics use. And, they call it waterless skin cleaner. I always wash it off with water. The second best option, if you don't have that, is soap and warm water. You never want to take anything sticky off of your skin with thinners unless you want that thinner to be just coursing through your blood, because that's what happens.
I shouldn't be alive, Russell, based on all the things you just said.
Well,
I'm better than I used to be, but I have a ways to go.
Well, neither should I, but I started really young in this, and I didn't fall. I was 13 when I started working with epoxy, and I couldn't afford gloves, So I shouldn't be alive either, but I really quickly started getting really working clean with this stuff, and I get more and more careful all the time.
Right. Okay. How about this one? Is epoxy a good base for all paints and varnishes?
Yes, it's a very good base. that sort of is related to the question about epoxies that don't, no amine blush. And I don't know if you want to, amine blush was one of your questions, so I'll just talk about that.
Let's throw that in here at the same time.
Yeah. Well, amine blush is a byproduct of the curing process in epoxy. And it's a waxy film that rises to the surface while the epoxy is curing. So you come in the morning and you touch your shiny epoxy and it's got this film on it. Well, that film is very easily taken off with a damp rag. If you have hot water and you dip it damp, you can basically just have it, wring most of the water out and scrub the surface, and it'll take that stuff right off. It will clog the sandpaper if you try to sand that surface with the amine blush present. So amine blush is kind of a non-issue, but a lot of epoxy companies have used it as their main marketing tool, comparing it to epoxies that have amine blush. And I'm just going to say it here, and I may get in trouble for it, but the West System Hardener 207 hardener is the very best hardener that does not produce amine blush. Actually, all no blush hardeners do produce some amine blush, but the 207 hardener is by far the least. Your original question was about coating and painting and varnishing over epoxy. West's 207 is also the best for that because it will do a much faster through cure than any of the other no blush hardeners. It's quite a bit different. 207 is actually very different in chemical makeup than any of the other no blush hardeners. And the hoops that West System jumps through to make this stuff are pretty incredible. It's actually a very, very expensive product for them to produce, much more expensive than the other companies' no blush hardeners, and they went down a very different road in producing this hardener. It's components in those hardeners, the no blush hardeners, are nonol phenol and phenol, and the nonol phenol is what everybody else uses. And it has, it's much cheaper to produce, but it has a much slower through cure, meaning you can wait sometimes up to 3 weeks before you can paint it. And the manufacturers will suggest that you wait that long before you're able to paint it. So it takes a lot longer to sand as well. The phenol-based 207 clear finishing hardener is what they're using it. I think that special clear hardener is what they're calling it. It's a phenol based, and it's got much higher physical properties than the nonol phenol hardeners, and it's your progress is much quicker if you're using that. You're able to sand it within a couple of days and repaint or coat over it, varnish, whatever. You're able to move quite a bit faster. It's worth the extra money. It's an absolutely wonderful product. Their 207 hardener is a really, really wonderful product, and it doesn't produce amine blush.
So kind of a related question here. So I've got, let's say I've epoxy coated my boat, 3 coats, and I've sanded it down. Can I apply my paint directly to the epoxy?
Yes.
And my varnish also?
Yeah, we're actually proponents of not using primer between I talk about that in the Epoxy Basics book, actually. We paint our boats with 2-part linear polyurethane paint, but we paint directly over epoxy. So instead of priming, we give the finished sanded hull basically a gloss coat of epoxy with 207 hardener. So it's a thin film of epoxy that's put on, and it has advantages over primer in that it flows out. So it basically it's a smooth finish instead of primer. If you roll it on, it's quite rough, or roller or brush. So it's a lot less sanding before painting. It's also much tougher than primer, and it helps moisture exclusiveness. It's a much better moisture barrier than primer is.
So you would use that in place of primer, one coat of 207?
Yeah, correct.
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
And then go right to your paint.
Yeah. We sand that 207 with 220 or something, and then start painting.
Okay. So we got another question here. There's some people that would say marine epoxy is not waterproof, that it has a low heat temperature deflection and can lose strength, and can also lose strength due to deep cycling, which this stuff gets really technical, Russell, but I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that.
Well, it's funny because I've never been a very technical guy. I'm a shop guy. I'm into the process. I'm not really into the theory.
Yeah.
But the water proof thing has always been a big question, and the basic answer is that there's nothing better at keeping moisture out of a structure than epoxy. They say about 10 mils, which is roughly 3 coats of epoxy, is the best thing on the planet as a coating for moisture exclusiveness. So, there's been a lot of testing done, obviously, to try to find better compounds and better, formulations for moisture exclusiveness, and basically it's pretty doggone good. They do testing where they're exposing they make little samples that are sealed with 3 coats of epoxy of some kind of very porous wood, and expose them to extreme heat and cold and moisture and dry and moisture, and then they'll just put them in heat and moisture, and they'll weigh that sample between each different cycle, and there's very, very, very little moisture gain in a scientific study. I have a 36-foot multi-hull that I built 20 some years ago, and it's a West System boat. It's been in the water almost continually for 20 some years, and we live in a damp environment here. The boat's doing just fine. There's no sign of anything going wrong besides, when you pull the anchor up and poke a hole in the hull, you have to fix it. But that's the only real visible water intrusion in the boat. What I really wish is that I'd been able to weigh the boat before launching it, and then I could weigh it now. That would be interesting. Your next question was about HDT and creep failure and creep resistance of epoxy. My feeling is that wood epoxy boats are a lot more viable than anyone really knows. There's so many different ways that they compete favorably with any other boat building method.
Yeah.
And HDT that's basically the decrease in physical properties with high temperatures, and that's not something that we really deal with in this kind of boat building. It's more something you're concerned with if you're making molds for for parts that have to get cooked at high temperatures, like pre-preg parts. West system epoxies, they begin to show signs of losing strength at between, 130 degrees about, and but they'll maintain 90% of their properties up to 200 degrees. So epoxies are actually quite resistant to high temperatures. And creep failure, that's really the same as tensile strength. So if you want to engineer something to be resistant to a failure, you would look at tensile strength. And creep is just not something that any of us really think about.
Yeah, okay. Well, we're going to wrap it up here, Russell. Maybe you could just give us contact information for your business, PT Watercraft, and your book.
Yeah, the Port Townsend Watercraft.com website is easy to find, and our Epoxy Basics book is there. We also have manuals for 3 different kit boats that we build that show a lot of other processes, and a lot of the processes are described in Epoxy Basics, but described in more detail in the manuals. So
the web address is ptwatercraft.com?
Yeah. And if you want to get a hold of us, it's info@ptwatercraft.com, like Port Townsend Watercraft.
Okay, very cool. Well, I appreciate you being on the podcast today and talking about epoxy.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Have fun building your boats now.
It's been fun.
Okay, take care, Russell.
All right.
Thanks, Russell, for taking the time to do the interview. I really appreciate it. You've got some great insight, and your work is amazing. For those of you listening, if you want to see some really amazing epoxy work, check out one of Russell's boats or go to his shop sometime in Port Townsend. You'll see what I mean. It's a real work of art. Or you can pick up his ebook on my website on the homepage on the right-hand side there. I would encourage you to do that because there is some great information there. Well, I checked the other day on iTunes, which my podcast has been on iTunes since I started in September 2011. And I now have 50 reviews, and I believe 49 out of the 50 are 5-star reviews, which is really awesome. If you haven't reviewed the podcast and give me a rating, I would encourage you to do that. If you have some constructive criticism, that would be awesome too. I would really appreciate that. If you go to iTunes to the podcast section, you can put in a search box there, Hooked on Wooden Boats, and that'll pull me up. And you can also subscribe while you are there so that each week when I publish a podcast, you get notified that the new episode is available for listening. Well, if you'd like to connect with me, I'm on Facebook, Twitter, Pinterest, and YouTube. If you look for Wooden Boat Dan in any of those places, you'll find me. Pretty fun. I think I've got about a dozen or maybe 13 videos now on my website. They're all pretty short, like 1 to 4 or 5 minutes. Some informational, some just fun. I would encourage you to check that out. You can also email me, dan@hookedonwoodenboats.com. I'd love to hear your ideas for potential people that I interview for the podcast, other constructive ideas you have for the podcast, how I could improve it. That would be awesome. And also, if you like the show, please call and leave a voice message and tell me what you like about it. Go to hookedonwoodenboats.com/voicemail. That'll take you to a spot on your computer where you can leave a message right from your computer up to 90 seconds in length. And then I can share that with the rest of the community. Well, I hope you've enjoyed the podcast, and I'm having fun doing it. It slows down in the winter, but you know what? There's always wood out there, and there's always boats around, and people willing to talk about them. So anyway, I hope you have a great week. Keep the bright side up and the barnacled side down. God bless. Wooden Boat Dan, over and out. Until we meet again next week.